Mr. Chairman, we are live.
Welcome, everybody. We're not sure what's going on, but we've got a couple members, one that's sick, three members, one that's sick and two that aren't here, and we're speculating that their diesels didn't start this morning or something. Two of them that aren't here are going to present bills, and they were the horse and burro bills. We're going to start with a different bill in our lineup. And I think we'll start with roll call and we'll keep it open because it's uncharacteristic for either of them to be gone.
Representative Blackburn,
Excuse.
Vice Chair Clausen.
Here.
Representative Fortner,
Here.
Representative Heiner.
Here.
Representative Larson,
Here.
Representative Western, Representative Worf,
Excused for now.
Representative Winter,
Excused for now.
and Chairman Eklund.
Here. So the first bill for our consideration is going to be House Bill 137, and it will be presented by its sponsor. So Representative Western, you want to walk us through the bill?
Mr. Chairman, committee members, so I present to you House Bill 137, and so I want to give a little bit of the why it's here and what problem is it solving. It's here because, as we all know, there is a process that we have for exchanging private lands for state lands. And I don't necessarily oppose this process or that this can even happen. My concern is that there's just a lack of transparency in this process, and this bill intends to fix that. Right now, broadly speaking, when an applicant submits an application for a land exchange, the public doesn't know or isn't aware until roughly 18 months into the process, give or take. And so generally by that time, as has been the case in certain instances where OSLI has already recommended that an exchange be approved by the board by the time the public is aware. So the process is already 75% of the way through the process by the time the public is even aware, involved, and has an opportunity to comment and voice their concerns. And so this bill intends to fix that. And as you can see, it's pretty straightforward, but right there at the bottom of page 2, it says that an application must be disclosed to the public within 30 days of submission. And the point here is to ensure that we are all on the same page at the same time, so no one feels left in the dark or excluded or not included in some of these considerations that are going on. So that's the body of the bill basically, and what we're trying to fix here. And we're trying to increase the level of trust in the Office of State Lands, and I believe transparency is the best way to do that. So, Mr. Chairman, I stand for any questions.
Committee questions? Okay. Here's one here. Representative Larson.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. Can you kind of briefly tell us the process that they would go through?
Mr. Chairman, Representative Larson, you mean the one that's currently in place?
No, your proposal. I guess we could all read it, but.
Sure, no, absolutely. Mr. Chairman, Representative Larson, this just promulgates language, as you can see on page 2, lines 1 through 16. This just puts in statute that an application must be submitted before the Board of Land Commissioners for an application to be considered and pending approval. And so as of right now, that process is an agency rule, and this lines 1 through 16 puts that in statute. And of course, subject to the following requirements, and you can see on lines 18 through 22 that the Office of State Lands and Investments disclose that application within 30 days of it being submitted. And if you want to walk through it, you see on page 3, lines 1 through 3, the notice shall specify the process through which members of the public can obtain additional information and comment on the land exchange proposal. And then obviously, section 2 just Board of Land Commissioners shall promulgate any of the rules necessary to implement this legislation, effective date. And that's pretty much the whole dog and pony show.
All right, thank you, Representative Western. We may have other questions, but we have state lands here. Would you like to come up, Mr. Crowder?
Morning, Mr. Chairman. My name is Jason Crowder. I'm Deputy Director for the Office of State Lands and Investments. I'm happy to walk through the bill and discuss really everything that we discussed in the interim when we talked about this topic as well, and answer any questions that you have. But off the bat, I think it's important to note that exchanges within the Office of State Lands and Investments come in a variety of different forms. We have very simple ones that are 40 acres for 40 acres, really a like for like situation, and may just clean up a management situation, and are really easy to manage, control, and nobody even pays attention to them. Nobody cares. We get into very complex transactions at the same time that have a commercial component to it, may have a building housing development component to it. We analyze really the gamut of real estate transactions through this program, and not one is conducive to a very tight process, I guess. Each one requires a different amount of analysis. Each one requires a different amount of sophistication and communication, and that's with locals in the area, that's with appraisers, that's with the Board of Land Commissioners or subject matter experts. So I just want to highlight that when we start talking about process within the real estate program, it needs to be very broad, because the type of transactions within these become very broad. And that's how the Board of Land Commissioners has written their rules, to be very broad and to be very nimble when we are presented with a particular situation. Each and every transaction obviously is analyzed to its merits and benefits to the trust beneficiaries. It's not necessarily to the office, it's not to the state of Wyoming as a whole, it's not to the Board of Land Commissioners, it's how does this transaction benefit or hinder the trust beneficiaries that we are entrusted to manage for. We do that through trust land management objectives. Those objectives have been given to us by the legislature through statute. They've been refined by the Board of Land Commissioners, and they are the measure that we push every transaction up against. And we need to have that analysis piece to even determine if we move forward with a transaction or not. If we waste our staff time, or we simply turn this proposal back to the applicant and say it doesn't meet our trust land management objectives, or it does and we need to move forward in the process. So when we speak about an application, applications are very sensitive in our office, I guess, because there's a lot of very important information provided in those applications. In the real estate world, as I said, when we have a variety of different opportunities and types of transactions that are presented to us, it's hard to narrow that down and ask the very specific questions that are required on a transaction by transaction basis. So we do provide an application to applicants that gives us general information about the transaction, gives us a general description. Where is the property? What county? How many acres? Is it forested? Is it just grass? Is there something else that's important on it? Is it a important habitat area? We ask for general attributes, meaning how does it currently generate revenue? How could it generate revenue? We ask for a general value. Generally, are we talking about $1 million versus $1 million, or 40,000 versus $1 million, to try to get a sense of what the transaction actually is? And then we require them to give a notice to the current grazing lessee if they're not the applicant within that process. But keep in mind that questionnaire, that application, is simply the applicant's view of the situation. We haven't been involved at all in this process. We can't verify. We haven't done any analysis on it to determine that the perception or the perspective of the applicant is the true one or an accurate one. It's simply their perspective. They haven't gone through an appraisal process. They may not know all of the documents that are recorded in our office or at the county courthouse, and so they're just giving us their perspective. And when we pull that together, it gives us an idea if we should move forward with this or if we should ask additional questions or simply tell them the variances, even from your perspective, are too far for us to pull together to create a successful transaction. It's really the starting point in the discussion. And the reason I say applications are sensitive in our office, when we talk about special use leases, when we talk about grazing leases, when we talk about oil and gas leases, the information provided on applications we hold to be fact, and we require them to be fact. And if they're not fact, then perhaps that lease was acquired by fraud and could be canceled later down the road. That is not at all how we use real estate applications. It's simply the beginning of the discussion because there are just so many different variables in this discussion. We need to be able to pull them together to create a successful transaction. So when we are requiring that the office provide an application to applicants and are almost expecting that those answers be fact, that could be problematic and could greatly limit the amount of applications we get into the office. It's important to note that we charge a $1,000 application fee for each application that comes in. And that is totally expected to compensate the office's time for administrative efforts when processing the application. A lot of folks don't like paying that. It's a rather high application fee. However, we want to make sure that the transaction has merit and that the applicant is invested in the process and will go through it with us. And it's a rather long and somewhat cumbersome process. So the application fee is warranted based on the amount of effort that we put into those. But we do have a lot of folks who call us before submitting the application. And we believe that requiring this level of analysis prior to even the office looking at a transaction may cause the public to ask us a lot more questions before submitting the application, causing a lot more work to be invested in each proposal prior to it getting an application fee in the office and prior to the staff being paid for the time and effort that they're putting into it. The bill requires that the applicant provide documentation of and evidence of value. We're expecting that to be an appraisal or something similar. We've talked with this committee at length through a few different interim topics about our appraisal process and how that is handled through the USPAP process, the Uniform Standards of Professional Appraisal Practice. And that is intended to make sure that we have a good and defendable value for each transaction, for each parcel that we're looking at. If we aren't using that process, then we are using internal assumptions or external assumptions that aren't verified by market data, by comparable sales. And we don't want to get into that world. We want to make sure that we're using a true and accurate valuation method when we're determining the value of these parcels. We also give instructions to the appraisers when they're appraising state land. It can't be that somebody just goes out and appraises somebody else's land without their authority. So obviously the Office of State Lands grants authority to appraisers to do that work. And inside of there, we want to make sure that they pay attention to certain attributes. And all of this is intended to not only find the highest value, but the true value as well. Is it accessible? Make sure you value it as if it's private land and not owned by a government entity, because essentially these lands are held in trust and operated as if they were private. So we give those instructions to the appraiser, and we expect to be able to review that appraisal to ensure that it meets USPAP standards. And all of these are existing and known processes within the appraisal world, separate from the state of Wyoming, but inside private transactions. This is how it occurs, and we want to make sure that we're doing the same as they are. We also don't necessarily talk about a value or set a value prior to allowing the Board of Land Commissioners to discuss the transaction and its general value in an executive session. And we're allowed to do that through the Public Meetings Act, and the Board of Land Commissioners takes advantage of that each and every transaction that we put in front of them, so that they can have a good conversation about the transaction without the fear of impacting the market. We do believe that if individuals possibly knew that the Board of Land Commissioners were interested in a transaction prior to a value being set, that somebody could come in and artificially raise or lower the value of the parcels adjoining the state land, and the state of Wyoming could be impacted in that way. And so we're very protective of those values and only determining what they are at a very specific time. Speaking to the 30-day notice period, I appreciate that, and I do think that it's important to talk about what our process is currently. Currently, we receive an application or a notice that an individual is proposing a transaction. We place that immediately on the Category 1 list. Category 1 transactions can only remain on that list for 1 year. They can't go past that year unless they're moved to the Category 2 list. If they go past the year, then they're removed from that list and they're removed from consideration. Within that year, we'll determine if the transaction largely follows the trust land management objectives. Obviously, we're not able to do a full analysis of it, but we will generally understand through conversations with the applicant if they do meet the trust land management objectives. And if they do, we'll provide it to the director for her consideration. She moves it to the Category 2 status, or she leaves it on Category 1 if she's not satisfied that the trust land management objectives are met. If she moves it to the Category 2 status, then it's ripe for Board of Land Commissioner initial consideration. And all of this happens, again, within that 1 year time period. It could happen within a week, it could happen within that 1 year, but it never goes past that 1 year time period. We provide the transaction to the Board of Land Commissioners in an executive session so that they are not talking about values or particular parts of the world or attributes that may have an ultimate impact on the value of those lands. And then they tell us, they don't make a decision, obviously, in executive session, but they tell us if they'd like to hear that transaction in an open session. And generally, that happens 90% of the time. Then we present that transaction to them at one of their regularly scheduled board meetings. It happens every other month. It's advertised on our website, and we present that transaction to them at that point. If they too agree that it largely meets the trust land management objectives, then at that point, all they're doing is approving us to move forward with the analysis phase. So we will provide to them a resolution to agree or not agree to, and really that gives the very broad sideboards of how a transaction will look from their perspective, from the Board of Land Commissioners' perspective. And it's largely make sure that you're trading merchantable title. Make sure that you're doing a value for value exchange. Make sure that you're getting some other compensation from this transaction, or limit the amount of cash equalization payment paid in each transaction. But it gives us the very broad sideboards that we can start analyzing too. And really, again, that is all that they're approving, is the analysis phase of the process. It's no final approval. It's no pre-approval or presupposition of what the outcome would be. It's simply office, go ahead and move forward. And at that point, we do place the transaction on our website. We place the application, we place the board matter, it includes a map, and it includes the resolution. And that happens after every single board meeting. So again, we're talking about Category 1 status that can go up to a year, Category 2 status that can go on as long as it needs to. But as soon as the Board of Land Commissioners makes that transaction public, it is up on our website and moving forward. So we are concerned that if we're talking about applications prior to us being able to go through that process, that it may hinder the amount of transactions we're able to review, because we may not get very many in. And we will not have the appropriate amount of analysis to provide to the public or the board to even get a good sense if we're moving forward with this or not. Part of the time frame is not only given to us by the rules, but it's also given to us by staffing ability. So we currently only have one staff member who are in charge of real estate transactions. And we do get a variety of these in that require, again, a variety of different types of analysis. And so sometimes we just simply run out of staff time to be able to move this forward in a quick manner. And we do things on a priority basis because of that. So it's not a first come, first serve as we move through the process. It's which application, which proposal provides the best benefit to the trust land beneficiaries, and we move forward with that one first. Mr. Chairman, I will largely end here with the office completes a detailed analysis after the board approves it to move forward in that phase. That detailed analysis includes the appraisal process, and it includes all of our staff time and analysis of the actual transaction, what each parcel brings to the table, its revenue generating potential, its habitat, its public accessibility, its commercial accessibility, just everything that that parcel, both private and state, bring is within that detailed analysis. We also borrow expertise from the Game and Fish Department, from our State Forestry Division, and from State Parks and Cultural Resources to further inform what the transaction looks like. And once that document is put together from a fiduciary perspective, from an office perspective, then we give it to the public for a 60-day public comment period. That is everything that we know about the parcel, and we've done our due diligence from a fiduciary's perspective and acting as the fiduciary to provide the information in that document. And then we rely on the public to tell us where we were right and where we were wrong, and the good and the bad that we may not have understood fully. Because there are a lot of folks who are neighbors to that parcel, who are much closer to it than we are, obviously, in Cheyenne. But that's a very good and important part of the process. It's 60 days long that they can provide comment. We advertise that on our website. We push that out through a Gov delivery notice to everybody subscribed on the website. We also provide copies of the detailed analysis to the county clerk and the county library and anything within the county courthouse so that folks can see that we're looking at it and that public comment period is open. We also provide notice to anybody who may have interest in the area, and that also includes local legislators and county commissioners to try to get the word out that this public comment period is open. After that, we do a public hearing in the county where the lands are located, invite the public to come in, or here lately we've done them through Zoom, but allow the public to give us oral comments related to the transaction as well. And it's only after that does the Board of Land Commissioners consider the transaction in a final sense to give us an approval to go up and down, and after considering all the public comments received. So, Mr. Chairman, that is the full process, and I'm happy to answer any questions. Just one quick thing at the end of the bill, we will, like, if the bill is passed, we will likely need to do some rule changes, and I'm not sure that we can get all of that completed by July 1st, and would ask for an extension of that to December sometime. And with that, Mr. Chairman, happy to answer any questions.
Questions? Representative Clausen.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So would you breeze just a little bit about you mentioned that you don't have to have the facts on the application, so I can basically send an application that's not necessarily a piece of fiction and it'll still be considered, or would you go over that? Because it seems a little strange.
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, Representative Clausen, that's a great question, and that is true. With that application, they have to provide the $1,000 application fee, so we feel like, or hope that they are submitting something that isn't just fiction, but has fact within it as well. But like I said, it starts the conversation. We will have a conversation with that applicant to say that this just doesn't seem appropriate or doesn't seem right. Let's work on this piece, or can you give us better information in this area? So they could give us just stars and rainbows, but we have that conversation with them to determine where those stars and rainbows in reality actually exist.
Representative Clausen, follow up.
And then one more question. So impact on the market. So I guess my background's in real estate, and I always wanted to get as many people to know that I had something for sale as I possibly could. Doesn't not having an impact on the market go against the fiduciary duty of getting the maximum for the school trust? I mean, that seems like the opposite of your constitutional duties. Could you explain that portion?
Absolutely, Mr. Chairman. Representative Clausen, you're right. And specifically, the Public Meeting Act talks about land acquisition and not sales. And so when we're in the buying side of an exchange or just simply acquiring a piece of property, that's where we're concerned about the market and how an influence or knowledge within the market may influence the values. And it's the acquisition side.
So, yeah, Representative Larson.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. I'm on your webpage right now, just trying to figure out where the discussion of land exchanges is. It's not jumping out at me.
Mr. Chairman, Representative Larson, I'm happy to point you there. At the top ribbon, there's a trust land management tab that pulls down a land transactions page. And once clicked on there, it'll give you all of the exchanges we're currently working on, exchanges that have been completed, as well as acquisitions and disposals that have been completed.
follow up? Oh, you got it? Okay. So those transactions that he's talking about, that's after it's gone through board approval and full analysis and,
Mr. Chairman, some of them that have been completed, that's correct, but the ones that are under consideration have only received initial board approval.
and they are on that website.
Mr.
Okay.
Chairman, that's correct.
All right. Representative Clausen.
Just one more question. So if we did do a 30-day notice period, do you think that the facts on the application would probably be a little closer to facts than fiction? Help out maybe in that area?
Mr. Chairman, Representative Clausen, I'm not sure what the results on the actual answers on the applications are. I simply stated, we receive a lot of applications, and as we move through the process and as we work through the real estate process, things change. Parcels change, configurations change, and we don't want to be held to what was said on the application as fact. We want to make sure that we are verifying and analyzing that through the process.
Okay. So what we do have here is a conflict when we get to that 30-day notice on the application, because category 2 could go on for years before there's any notice that the application has been received or considered by the board. Am I correct there?
Mr. Chairman, there's no notice that an application has been received by the office because we determine it or expect it to be a conversation. Once that's been reviewed by the board, yes, it's out there on the website. And the conflict does largely revolve around the board's rules currently that require us to keep all category 1 transactions confidential until they're moved by the board into an open session.
Okay. So you got other questions? Go
I
ahead.
do, Mr.
Representative
Chairman.
Larson.
I know we discuss this quite often in our interim committee meetings, but it's always good to refresh. So is it usually a land exchange that happens? Do we have policy in the state that we're trying to keep our acres kind of the same over the years?
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, Representative Larson, that's a great question. We look at largely only exchanges for a couple different reasons. One is that seems to make the most fiduciary sense to maintain ownership within the state, to maintain it in land and not investments. And that's something that the legislature has indicated, that they want the portfolio to have a large component of land owned. And so we look at exchanges rather than disposition of land first. Then the legislature also gave us an indication through a budget footnote, so it's no longer a requirement, but we still maintain it. And that happened back in 2005, that the Board of Land Commissioners would determine a baseline amount of acreage owned. They'd use 1999 as that baseline and not go above or below that baseline by an amount of 10,000 acres. And so with each and every transaction, we pay attention to that. And currently we're 3,300 acres below that baseline.
No further questions? Okay, so I've got, what we worked on during the interim was to be a land exchange between the federal government and the state. This is a bit different. And if Representative Western could maybe just give us a scenario that prompted the bill. Could you help us with that? And then I'd have a better understanding of how we might be able to fix this and incorporate it into what state lands already does.
Mr. Chairman, I'd be happy to. So again, there certainly are, these very simple exchanges that are straightforward, 100 acres for 100 acres. But as Mr. Crowder elaborated, some of them do get pretty complex in terms of the size, cost, appraisals, all that stuff. And in this, there's a specific situation in Sheridan County where from the time the application was submitted to the time it was recommended by OSLI staff for approval by the board, it was right around 24-ish months, 20 months ballpark. And so there are a lot of folks in the public I know who felt that they were kind of kept in the dark, who they were not included, because ultimately this land is owned by the state of Wyoming and by all of us. And so the concern was that a lot of folks sportsmen. I know there's folks in ag who just kind of felt blindsided that none of us were included on this. None of us were even aware until they felt that the cake was kind of baked at that point. And so I think land exchanges can be a great tool for many components, for sportsmen, for agriculture, for land management. But I think it just needs to make sure that it's done in a way that's truly fair to everybody. And so I think just, if anything, I believe this strengthens the process so that from square one, everybody from every walk of life can look at this and weigh in. And if it really is beneficial, obviously, first and foremost, for the trust beneficiaries, that's priority number one, but for everybody in the public, sportsmen, ag, just everyday folks, so they have a chance to look at this and provide feedback. And I think the best ones that are truly good for everybody, I think those are the ones that will go through the process and garner support, so that throughout that whole process, there's a pretty small or almost no one pushing back against this, because everyone's been included from the very start. So that's kind of the impetus for this, is to ensure that these types of situations where people feel they've been kept in the dark or people feel blindsided, that these processes are an inclusive and transparent way.
Okay. I don't know if that's us or Jet. So the reason it's kept in confidence is the application and the analysis that's going on. It's kept fairly confidential until what point? You're in category 2, or until you've got the approval to go through the full analysis with the board?
Mr. Chairman, that's correct. It's when we get approval from the board to start our analysis phase.
All right. Representative Worf.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I guess as a follow-up to Representative Western's statement, wouldn't you agree that quite often when we see these complex land exchanges, by the time it does roll out, there's been such a time-consuming event from the state that by the time it rolls out, if in fact there is public opposition to that, a lot of times, as he said, the cake's already baked and all we can do is frost it. And I think that's what this is trying to do, is allow more people to see and understand what is taking place within the state lands. And it is a complex issue. I don't disagree with that, but I know in a prior life, I represented sportsmen, and I know there were exchanges that popped up that had significant impacts on sportsmen's access, hunting, issues like that, and they did feel blindsided. So that is why I signed on to this bill, is to try to elevate that up and make sure that we are being as transparent as we can be in this process. So I would urge this body to look at a way in which we can make it work for state lands, but also make it work for the public. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Yeah,
Mr.
Representative
Chairman.
Larson.
Wait,
We got more.
I would allow, did he get a chance to answer my question?
Okay,
Do you not think it is already half
well,
or primarily baked? I mean,
yeah,
that's my question.
go ahead.
Thank you, Mr.
Mr.
Chairman, and thank you, Mr. Representative Worf. I don't think it's baked by the time it gets to the public's viewpoint. And I say viewpoint because there are a lot of different perspectives in each and every transaction. And as I stated, we have an applicant's viewpoint or perspective about what he's trying to accomplish with the transaction. And we need to apply a viewpoint, not from the state of Wyoming, but from a fiduciary standpoint, based on the trust land management objectives. What is in the best interest of those trust land state trust land beneficiaries. And that's not the same most of the time as the applicant, and it might not be the same as the sportsman or the general public, but we need to provide that information to the conversation. It's also important to note that the third objective within the board's 3 trust land management objectives is community need. And within that community need is public access. So we do analyze how we expect public access to be impacted by a transaction. And as you're aware, there are a lot of different viewpoints within the public and the sporting interest that public access has to be by a road, or public access has no roads involved. And so what we want to do is give an unbiased view of actually what does this transaction provide to the trust land beneficiaries? And then from the sportsman component, this is it. It has legal access. You can drive on it. You can't drive on it. It has a giant cliff or whatever, but we provide all that information to the public to provide comments back to us. So I don't feel like it's baked once it reaches the public comment piece. I feel like we've given our perspective just like as the applicant has, and now we're expecting the public and the sportsmen to bring their piece to the conversation.
Okay. We have several questions. Go ahead, Representative Larson. Here we think we got a fairly simple bill, and we find out the complexities of changing law. Go ahead.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. I think you've gone over quite a bit of this, but I want to go over it again, the process. After the part where you're getting it out to the public, is it required that it's in the paper, maybe even an article, and also a mention that there will be a public hearing in that area, maybe in a couple places in that area? Because it is so vital. I see it's on the webpage, but I don't think I'm gonna go there and look.
Mr. Chairman, Representative Larson, that's a great question. And yes, we are required to advertise those in the local paper, and we do that. And depending on the parcel, we may even go international with our advertisement, just to, as Representative Clausen mentioned, when we're selling a piece of property, we want to get as much interest in that as possible. So we're going to advertise it to whatever demand the piece of property brings to it. The current statute requires us to have a 30-day public comment period, and the board has extended that to 60 days. The current statute also requires that we only hold a public hearing if requested by the county commissioners, and the Board of Land Commissioners has gone further to say we will always have a public hearing in the county that's affected. So currently, the rules are a little bit more forward-reaching than the existing statute is. And as you recall, the board had just amended its rules to allow for an expedited land exchange process for those very small parcels that have no public interest really, or are a like-for-like scenario, and there's a desire and an intent and a benefit to see something move forward much quicker than the process that I laid out to you earlier. And we lean on those existing statutes to expedite that process. And of course, if there's ever a time when that expedited process does not meet the muster required by the public or our analysis from a fiduciary standpoint, we pull it out, we put it in the longer process. But Representative Larson, I hope that answers your question.
Okay, thank you. I'm gonna get to you, but I got a question for Representative Western. In the case that really prompted this bill to come before us, or in the circumstances where you were blindsided, was there no advertising, or people just kind of missed it, or what went on there?
Mr. Chairman, so the sense of being blindsided came from when it was released on the website, word immediately spread. It was that when it happened, I think it was late April of last year, the public notice was posted on OSLI's website. But once we learned that the application was submitted almost 2 years prior, and there's been no public involvement or any kind of notice that this was happening, that's where that sense of being blindsided is, that we're 24 months into this process and we're only finding out now. And I as Mr. Crowder said, that during that phase 1 process, it remains confidential, and that process is a year. Plus the extra time that goes by during the phase 2 process that eventually leads to public disclosure. And so that's, I think, again, it's not that this process exists, it's just that making sure everyone is on the same page at the same time. And I appreciate Mr. Crowder's comments that when an application is submitted, it's as is. It has not gone through any sort of vetting, and I can appreciate that, but I think that can be largely remedied by just saying, after being disclosed within 30 days, should this legislation pass, OSLI can put a notice on the application saying this has not gone through any sort of vetting by the state. This is just an as-is application. Buyer beware. Do you understand that this has not had any kind of thorough vetting process by the state and on the application? So they're not viewing it in a different way. They're just, everyone's on the same page and they see it. This is simply just the application, hasn't gone through vetting or consideration or any type of scrutiny.
Okay, so in your particular case, though, it did go through board approval for an analysis, and then did it go into a 60-day comment period? And then how did that work? How did that work for you?
Mr. Chairman, so by the time the public was disclosed, it had already received a positive recommendation for consideration by the board. And so getting back to Representative Wharf's comments, I think that's where the concern of that is, that they weren't included from square one. And so that's during that 60-day period, a lot of sportsmen came out and others just saying, you know, we're really upset with this. We felt that we were kept in the dark the whole time and we're only finding out just now. And that was, I think, late April, early May. It was disclosed on OSLI's website, and 3 months later, it went before consideration before the board. I believe that was early August. That's 4 months. So that was that time frame.
Okay, just one more question for Representative Western. So during the 60-day comment period, were you unable to affect the outcome of the land exchange?
Mr. Chairman, we did not.
Okay,
Also, just for the record, it's still pending further deliberations, but.
okay, so is yours going to be piggybacking on this? Okay, we'll start there. I'm not done over on this side either. Go ahead, Bob.
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, I just wanted to add, one of the complexities that I see that I don't know that the land board really is set up to address it, but I think that's where this problem comes from. Dealing with sportsmen, the impact is always local. And so if it's your hunting spot, it's a big deal. But sometimes sportsmen aren't on the same page. And there's a lot of times it happens where everybody else is saying, doesn't matter, doesn't affect me. But as sportsmen get talking about it, they start to realize that it does have consequences. Because if that area is no longer available, those sportsmen are going to be dislocated. They're going to go find another place, and it may impact you on the spot where you hunt. So that's the problem that I see, is sometimes by the time the word gets out, it's advertised locally, but the impacts are statewide. And in some instances, they go well beyond the state. So I think that's what we're trying to get at is, you know, that there is a large segment of the public, and I don't want to say that sportsmen are more important than anybody else, but I think that the problem arises from the fact that the impacts are local, but sometimes there's cascading impacts that I'm not sure the state land board has even looked at. And that's only brought to light when the sportsmen actually have a chance to look at it and really understand what those impacts would be. So I believe, Mr. Chairman, I hope that helps. The complexity, I think, comes from adding another large segment of the public, and they're feeling like they're not being given adequate time to actually understand that. Mr. Chairman, I hope that helps.
Yeah, and I'll get back to you for a response. Let's field a couple more concerns or questions. Go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This bill, House Bill 137, is all about transparency, in my opinion. I mean, and to me, transparency outweighs complexity. If you're not transparent in the get-go to the citizens of the state of Wyoming on what you're doing, then complexity goes out the window, in my opinion. Thank you.
Yeah. Representative Heiner.
Thank you, Chairman. Deputy Director Crowder, I'm sure there's a lot of these applications that come through that never reach fruition. And it's a tremendous load on your department because each one that comes through, you have to go through archaeology, you have to go through the minerals, the wildlife. There's a lot of efforts that go into this, and then they ultimately don't happen for one reason or other. Could you give me a sense of how many you get and how many actually go to exchange during the course of this process?
Mr.
Go
Chairman.
ahead, Mr. Crowder.
Representative Heiner. Yeah, it's changes year by year and specific circumstances. Obviously, you need a willing buyer, willing seller, and we're not out beating the drum to try to get applications in. We just receive them as they come. But typically, this last year, I believe we've received anywhere from 6 to 8 applications, and we haven't moved forward with any of them at this point. Some of them are in the phase to start moving forward, but largely they are just things that would really benefit a specific rancher and would really harm the sportsman or the beneficiaries. And so we tell them that that doesn't meet trust land management objectives and we're not moving it forward until some change has occurred. And I think that's an important point to Representative Western's point. When we receive an application, we may have that. We may have that exact situation where it just does not make sense at all, and so we're not going to move forward. So we represent that to the applicant and tell him, these are the things that we have concerns with. This is where it's not meeting the objectives. Can you adjust? And that is exactly what happened in the Sheridan cases. He originally proposed something that wasn't going to meet objectives, and he adjusted through that period of time that we were in Category 1 and Category 2 to give us a transaction that did have some merit of success in front of the board.
Okay. All right, I'm gonna move to more public testimony right now. We'll try to figure out if we can get this to conform with what you're doing. So on the transparency issue, Representative Fortner brought out that issue, and I think it's important with public lands. If you're involved in some kind of a private land, not usually exchange, but transaction, you try to keep it kind of quiet until you've determined you have some contractual decisions or agreements made by the parties buying and selling. So I'm trying to figure out how we can get things before the public without blowing up a deal that needs to be more confidential, I guess. So let's have more public testimony if there is some. Yes, Mr. Magagna.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Jim McGaggan with the Wyoming Stockgrowers Association. We certainly support the concept of the need for transparency, but I will tell you that we cannot support this bill as it currently stands for a couple of reasons. I believe Mr. Crowder well outlined the complexities. And our experience is, particularly, I'm going to be focused on scenarios where an adjacent ag landowner is the applicant to acquire a piece of state land that's within their operation, which happens very frequently. And their application is usually just a way to say, let's start a conversation. If I go into the state land office and say, I don't have an application, but I want to talk to you about this exchange, I'm not going to get much attention because their workload is heavy and they don't have time for just an in-depth conversation. So I file an application in order to demonstrate that I want a serious conversation. And the first part of that discussion, prior to being moved over to the second list, as Mr. Crowder explained, is about a conversation. And those conversations at that point should be allowed to be confidential. One of the challenges that a landowner wanting to acquire a parcel of state land faces is, what land do I exchange for it? He may not own land that would have any appeal or practicality for the state to acquire. So he's gone out and talked with another third party about potentially purchasing a piece of land for this exchange. And that happens fairly frequently. And his negotiations with that other third party are private, confidential negotiations that at some point need to be public, obviously, if it's going to become public land. But at that early phase are discussions that that landowner is not free to just advertise to the public. It's the piece of land he's looking at that point, it's somewhat confidential that he's looking at acquiring a piece of land to enter into a trade with the state. So we feel very strongly, and I think the way it's worked in the past, that first phase helping the state land office to understand the objectives of the applicant, helping the applicant to understand what the needs are, what the factors are that are going to drive the state decision as to whether or not to recommend to the board that they move into phase 2 with this transaction. That's not an appropriate time for these other considerations. Certainly in phase 2, in making a recommendation to the board and in the board making their final decision, these broader impacts are very valid and should be given full consideration. And we support that, whether it's impacts on public access or whatever those may be. But we've always viewed that phase 1 as building understanding on both sides, building that relationship. And I would say to you, Mr. Chairman, and members of the committee, if we need to extend the public comment period following that land being moved to phase 2, and say that there needs to be a longer period before it's actually put before the board for a final decision, we're certainly open and looking at that. But we see real problems being caused by building that public notice into phase 1. I think it destroys the nature of the confidentiality and the nature of the serious discussion that needs to place before either side has even agreed that they want to move forward. When the applicant hears the position of the state land office and what their concerns are, an applicant may well say, well, given those factors, I'm just going to drop the application. I don't see any point in moving forward. And as Mr. Crowder pointed out, the state may look at this and say, well, this isn't going to work for us. There's no point in moving forward. So with that, Mr. Chairman, I would simply say that we would urge you a no vote on this bill as it stands today. Happy to take any questions.
Representative Clausen.
Mr. Chairman, Mr. McGagnis, so I guess I see things a different way, and I think your membership probably would too. And I'll throw out this hypothetical scenario, or maybe, well, it's not really hypothetical. I think it's probably a real scenario, but let's say there's a section of state land right across from somebody's house and they don't have the lease on it. Let's say the fence is right there, and so they don't ever have a notice until, could be 18 months, 2 years out, that this piece of property is not only up for exchange, but it might be up for exchange for some sort of industrial use that might not necessarily be the greatest for their family or the value of their land that surrounds them, or 100 different things. Wouldn't you say your membership would rather know that this was going on than be left in the dark for 2-3 years?
Mr. Chairman, Representative Clausen, the scenario you've portrayed, that would be nice to know that. If that's the concern, I think that could be addressed perhaps with some provision of notice to adjacent landowners or something. But in all the scenarios that I've dealt with, I've not seen one where the landowner, the grazing lessee, or if not a lessee, felt that they were blindsided by something because they didn't know that some discussions had been initiated, as opposed to that the office is proposing to make a recommendation to the board. Because quite frankly, until something is proposed to the board, there's no real opportunity for public input anyway, because it's the public input on these matters goes before the board. It's not the director of the Office of State Lands that's assessing that public input. It's the board that's charged with the management of state trust lands.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Do we have other public testimony? Okay. So the testimony is closed. Committee, what's your pleasure? Been moved by Clausen, seconded by Western. Discussion or amendments? Okay, go ahead, Representative Worf.
Mr. Chairman, I would be willing to help. Director Crowder mentioned in his testimony that he thought the July 1st timeline was too late, and requested that we give them more time to complete that. And having consulted with the bill sponsor, or the primary bill sponsor, I think that that's something we could do. So I believe he said December 1st. Is that correct, Deputy Director? So I would make the motion that we amend on page 3, line 7, that we change it before July 1st, 2022, that we change that to December 1st.
Okay, it's been moved that we amend it to December 1st. Been seconded by Western. Do you have that amendment? Carol, it's on page 3, line 7. Okay,
Yes.
all right. All those in favor of that amendment, say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Okay, any other amendments? Yeah, I'd have a comment here. So if this bill moves forward, I guess I would like to see especially the bill sponsor, maybe work with state lands to see if it could be modified to better fit their rules, because right now it doesn't. And if we pass it through the House, we run the risk of maybe being vetoed if we don't get this thing fairly right. Usually there are ways of amending it. Until we heard the full testimony on the process, it's usually happening. I didn't see that there'd be any problems. But anyway, any other discussion? Yes, go ahead, Representative Clausen, then you, Representative Heiner.
Mr. Chairman, just a little slight pushback. I think agencies should amend their rules to statute. I mean, the statute, this comes from the people that transparency is enormously important. I think definitely it should go the other way.
Yeah, and my response to that is I agree, except that we have reduced the size of government to the point where their office may not be able to handle the workload to be able to meet the deadlines and the demands of this bill. So I'll defend them a little bit on that, but I do agree. Representative Heiner.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Out of respect for the good bringer of the bill, I want to let everyone know I'm going to vote a no on this. I've been reviewing the webpage of the Office of State Lands and Investments, and they are doing, in my opinion, a good job of putting this out for everyone to see. I know a lot of these applications go through rigorous review through the different departments of the state, and it takes a long time to get to the point where it needs to be in public view, because there's a lot of things that go on behind the scenes. And then when it comes time that they've dotted all the I's and crossed the T's, they put it out for a 60-day comment period. And I see a lot of comments that have come in, but I think they do try to be consistent and detailed in their review process. And I think if we have them advertise every time one comes up, put it on their webpage prematurely, it's going to cause undue excitement throughout the communities, because many of these never come to fruition. So I'm going to be a no on this.
Representative Larson.
Mr. Chairman, I too will probably be a no, or gonna be. After looking at the webpage, I agree also that there's quite a bit of information on here, and maybe I would suggest this, maybe we should bring it up as an interim topic so we can all discuss it some more. I'm gonna be a no.
Okay. And I may be too, but the idea of an interim topic is a good plan, because I don't think we've finished with our federal and state land exchanges. We have millions of acres of state land stranded, and we can't use it, and I think we need to readdress that maybe in the interim. But question being called for committee, are you ready to vote? Roll call.
Representative Blackburn,
He's excused.
Vice Chair Clausen,
Aye.
Representative Fortner,
Aye.
Representative Heiner, Representative Larson,
No.
Representative Western, Representative Worf, Representative Winter, Chairman Eklund.
No.
4 ayes and 4 noes, which, trying to remember,
If it fails,
it fails.
yeah, on a tie vote. Committee, keep in mind, we have interim topics coming up, and this, I think, can maybe be combined with the idea of continuing our discussion of the federal and state land exchanges. Okay, now I'm not sure, that took longer than I thought it would. We've got 2 horse and donkey bills coming up here. And I'm pretty sure we will not get to Representative Larson's basically brucellosis bill. So until Thursday, we have one other bill under consideration that day. So if there are people here for the infectious disease bill, you probably, I think we'll just not even try to do it. And if you can get notice, Carol or somebody can, to Representative Larson that he won't be needing to come down here, we'll work on that thing on Thursday. That'd be best. So let's go ahead and start with the first of these 2 bills. And that would be House Bill 5. And Representative Western, you'll go ahead and go through that and explain why this bill has been prompted. Who'd I say? Oh, I'm sorry. I'm sorry, John. Representative Winter.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I hope I represent this correctly. This bill was, as I remember, was created as an effort to get the attention of the federal agencies who are charged with responsibility of properly managing the wild horse populations in Wyoming. Herd populations have been established by the federal agencies, but they have ignored their mandate to manage the horse numbers. And probably the most important objective that we have here with this situation is the range resource. With 5 to 7 years of drought on this very fragile ecosystem, we are close to losing it, the resource that is. And this rangeland is approximately 50% private and state. The rest is federal. Domestic livestock are also permitted to graze this land. However, the horses are there 365 days a year and tend to control the water sources. Thus keeping the authorized livestock away. It is difficult to get meaningful management on these horse populations. This bill is also, or will allow the Office of State Lands and Investments to assess the grazing costs of these horses to the Department of the Interior and Agriculture for reimbursement. Let's see. Upon failure or refusal of the U.S. BLM or Forest Service to remove any wild horses claimed by the United States Bureau of Land Management or Forest Service, anyway, the Office of State Lands Investments shall provide the United States Secretary of the Interior or Secretary of Agriculture as applicable with annual notice identifying the grazing cost of those wild horses and a request for reimbursement of these costs. And if for some reason these horses are not, the excess are not taken off, then the amount that would be charged would be 3 times the land lease rate per animal unit month for the Wyoming Trust grazing leases. The Attorney General may seek a writ of mandamus to compel the U.S. BLM or Forest Service, as applicable, to take action to remove excess wild horses as required under federal law from non-federal lands, recognizing that wild horses roam without regard to political boundaries. The non-federal lands for which a writ of mandamus is sought under this subsection may include private land. And to manage wild horses in the state, including on the Wind River Indian Reservation, the governor is authorized to enter into cooperative agreements among state and local agencies and with the U.S. BLM and Forest Service, the Eastern Shoshone Tribe, the Northern Arapaho Tribe, and an official cooperative tribal governing body, adjacent states, non-governmental organizations, or other private entities. A cooperative agreement under this subsection may provide for any cooperative undertaking to manage wild horses, including population reduction tactics, permanent and temporary fertility control techniques, expanding number of wild horse training and adoption programs, and other removal activities. And there has been a $2 million appropriation for this effort. So that's kind of the basis.
Okay, any questions for Representative Fortner? I'll open it up to public comment. Okay, I'll start with our agency man, Mr. Crowder. Come on up again.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Jason Crowder, again, Deputy Director for the Office of State Lands and Investments. We've spoken at length about this bill during the interim and greatly appreciate its intent. Obviously, we own lands within herd management areas, and obviously wild horses are utilizing those lands and possibly removing forage that would otherwise be available for our lessees or livestock producers. So anytime we can be helpful in this conversation, we absolutely want to do that. I will note that currently within the notes and information we have in the office, that impact is largely theoretical. We know that it occurs on the ground, but nobody's really written to us, requested for a rent reduction, requested for an AUM reassessment to reduce those AUMs. That's just not present in our office. And we anticipate if this bill is passed that perhaps that might increase and we might have some places we can start paying attention to. But just to let the committee know right now, maybe it's because our lessees don't see fruit in that effort, but we just don't have that information in our office currently. As the bill is written, it requires that the office provide a notice to the federal government of horses that are above AML and place a value on that. We're struggling a little bit and would appreciate any guidance that the committee could give us of what that trigger might be. Specifically on page 3, line 9, it says upon failure or refusal. And we read that to be that possibly the office would send a demand letter to the federal government and not receive a response, therefore triggering the secondary notice. Or we could simply utilize horse numbers, population numbers above AML at a certain point in the year and provide that. But any guidance that the committee could give us to tell us when refusal or failure would occur, and then we can further send that notice to the federal government would be appreciated. As we noted in the interim, we have worked on a spreadsheet as indicated by the draft bill, trying to understand exactly what the impacts are, how many lands, how many acres we're talking about, where they occur. And it's important to note that state lands is a relatively small portion of each one of these herd management areas, the largest being 12%. But mostly it revolves around the 2 to 5% range. So when the bill identifies affected non-federal lands, it's largely meaning state and a very small portion of municipal or county lands. And we're really not talking about a large total number of acreage here. In our spreadsheet, we've did an assessment to determine what is the absolute biggest notice that we could give the federal government. And based on this year's AUM rate of $5.24 per AUM, which is what we charge grazing lessees across the state, that's roughly $34,000. So what that means is that each parcel of state land and county and municipal land within each one of these herd management areas, if they provided some type of evidence that wild horses were regularly grazing, that would be the upper limit of what we would send to the federal government as a notice. And of course, any reduction of that or lack of information would go down from there. Mr. Chairman, I'm happy to answer any other questions you might have about the bill.
Okay, so the public knows the method we'd use to notify the federal government is called a writ of mandamus. And it's about as strong a way of sending a bill to Uncle Sam as we can send. I guess in comment to, I was surprised at your $34,000 figure. I think what we're trying to do here is get a message to the federal government that something needs to be done. During the interim, when we had these conversations, we had huge public turnout, public buy-in and agreement that something needed to be done. There were even from the horse conservationists, they wanted to deal with anything short of killing the animals. They weren't okay with that part, but they were okay with what surprised me, and maybe it was just one person's opinion in that permanent sterilization when they're captured would be a good means of slowing the buildup of this herd. We do not presently have enough adopters to take care of the animals that show up. And boy, they breed like rats. They're capable of has anybody seen a foal born? Unless you had trouble with the mare, you probably never seen them born. They just slip out, have a colt, and next thing you know, there's a nice healthy horse on the ground. So we do have a problem, and as much as anything, I may work on that language on page 3 that you talked about, but even though the cost that we can, or the bill we can send to the federal government is low, we need to do something about it now. I've seen, I don't know the rangeland that Representative Winter talks about exactly, but I've seen that part of the country, and I think mine is fragile here in eastern Laramie County. That out on the desert is just, it'll be a short period of time before it just goes to probably fairly undesirable weeds, which will complicate the problem. So, committee, any questions for, yes, Representative Winter.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Deputy Director, do we not have a responsibility to our private landowners in this state in addition to our state lands? And I'm not trying to be combative here, but I'd like to know what you folks, where you approach this type of a consideration.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Representative Winter, I think that's a great question. Obviously, the authority of the Board of Land Commissioners is very specific to the state trust land, and it doesn't extend any further than that. So we don't express any authority or any management philosophy on private lands adjacent to the state lands. We're focused on the blue squares on the map. But that being said, we recognize that wild horses and just like noxious weeds is a landscape problem. And we're happy to be a part of that conversation and have been in the past. We've worked with the governor's office previously when they've attempted to work on this issue, and we provide data and information to them any way we can, because we do recognize, as I mentioned earlier, that there's likely an impact from these horses on state land. While we don't have evidence of it in the office, that is obviously occurring to anybody with any common sense. So what we want to do is be participating in the conversation. We want to be helpful in any way that we can, understanding that our authority, the Board of Land Commissioners' authority, is very specific to the state trust land.
Representative Winter, go ahead.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman. So then what you're telling me is that we need to go directly to the governor and get some action from him, because you folks aren't able to go to pursue this, is that correct?
Mr. Chairman, Representative Winter, I don't know if I characterized it that way. I do believe if we had a known and evidenced reason to move forward and take some action against the federal government, we have that opportunity and ability through the AG's office. My representation to you is when we address this issue, we don't have that evidence in-house. We don't have staff that have gone out and done that research or to know what's exactly happening on the state trust land within these herd management areas.
Okay, and I'm not sure. I'm not sure that we've addressed it in here, but I think it could be inserted in here, a means for the leasee owner or the landowners to go ahead and provide documentation to your office. More than likely, you can't do it yourselves.
Well, Mr. Chairman, I apologize, but I do think we can. I do think if this was, if this bill were passed, and specifically the portion that talks about evidence of regularly grazed, we would send notice to our grazing lessees to say this is passed and this is an opportunity for you to tell us what's happening out on the ground, because we need that. We need to leverage those lessees to get information out there. We provide annual notices to grazing lessees each year with their billing and with their invoices, and we talk about subleases. We talk about a variety of different things, and we feel like we can insert this into that conversation.
Okay, so you could do it in rules without us having to change anything that's in this.
Mr.
in
Chairman,
this
that's correct.
Document. Okay. Representative Fortner.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. For $34,000 worth of damage, you know, I'm sort of, I was all for this bill before we started down that road. But if we go to bill federal government for that, as scared as we are as federal government or from federal government to do anything with them, I think this is just gonna be a hollow bill myself. I don't see where, on the charge part of it, it's gonna do any good, because there's no teeth in it that I can see, other than a threat to the government, the sort of a kickback to them saying, hey, you know, we're not happy, so. But anyways, that's what I see in it.
Okay. I believe in some ways you're right. The monetary part of it probably doesn't have a lot of teeth to it, but having virtually everybody affected by these horses at the table when we discussed it, I couldn't think of anybody else. The tribal representatives were there, the BLM was there with the private landowners, the horse conservation groups, we were all there talking about it. So I think it may have more effect than the $34,000. Go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And you're absolutely right. You're 100% right. And the question was asked about the sage grouse habitat and that the wild horses was damaging. That's a huge one right there. You know, there's a lot more that we could add to this bill, I think, to put more teeth in it rather than to try to charge the federal government.
Okay. We'll get to an amendment process in a bit. If you've got some ideas, start jotting them down. You're good? Okay, other public testimony. Okay, come on up, Brad.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Committee, Brett Moline, Wyoming Farm Bureau Federation, sitting in support of this bill. This problem is not going to get less. It's going to keep getting more. As far as not having the information about what the actual damage is, I think it's readily available to obtain. We have several agencies across the state that are in every county, every region, naming Cooperative Extension Service that has a range scientists in every quadrant of the state, every portion of the state. We have the NRCS, we have the BLM themselves. Perhaps the money right now isn't that important, but you know, the principle is. By taking this forward, we're showing that the state of Wyoming is serious. We have to do something. And I think working the impact in on the other species is easily done. You know, by the way you gather data, you can document the potential problem you're having on, remember in testimony in committee, the winter range for some of the large game, the habitat for the sage grouse. But I think getting these feral horses under control is paramount. We haven't done it for decades. Now we're reaping the negative impacts of it. You know, and some other things to think about, you know, in talking with some of my members, you know, if you want to do a water development on the state lands to benefit your livestock and there's feral horses there, why? We've all seen what horses will do to other animals. They'll run off the other animals and they won't have access to that water. So why develop it? So that's hurting the state lands, it's hurting the private lands, it's hurting everything. And I strongly urge for this bill to go forward. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I would sit for any questions.
Questions? Yeah, Representative Heiner.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Moline, as you look at the two bills that are very similar that are before the committee today, I have problems sending both of them that it may just confuse the matter and we may not have the desired effect that we want in the chamber. If we were to put one of them forward, which one would you choose?
Mr. Chairman, Representative, it's funny you bring that question up. I have had those thoughts myself. Of the two bills, I think House Bill 5 is more important to take forward. There is some tribulation with House Bill 24 that the state would take over the management. I would rather have the federal government be forced to stick with the agreements that we've already made. We've already come up with the level of feral horses that we will have. That agreement it's gotten better, but we haven't abided by that for years. We can always do more later. So, Mr. Chairman, Representative, in my opinion, House Bill 5 of the two should probably be the one to go forward first.
Okay, so the members of the public that might be online listening, we have a second bill that'll come, and it's just a little bit different, has a little different twist on it. Also has some merit, but we'll discuss that later. But I appreciate that you had already studied it, Mr. Moline, and could answer that question. Any other questions by members here? Okay, thank you.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. Thank you, committee.
Yes, come on up, Mr. McGagna.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Again, Jim McGagnon, Wyoming Stockgrowers Association. First, I want to express our appreciation to this committee who took this issue up at our request during the interim and worked on this and the other bill as well. Just a couple of things on this, and we strongly support this bill and would urge it to move forward. I think we need to be cautious with looking at dollar numbers such as Mr. Crowder presented to you. And as a clear example of that, until this fall, there were an additional 3,500 wild horses in an area in southwestern Wyoming. The BLM has since moved to gather those horses. So clearly the dollar amount, whether it was calculated last year with over nearly 6,000 horses in that particular area versus calculating it this year with 2,500 is going to be different. And that's going to vary over time as those herds build up more and exceed AMLs. So the triple billing factor comes in, that number is going to change. So I think we need to be careful with that. The second thing I would point out in terms of the responsibility of state lands, that this doesn't really put a burden on them. If you look at the language on page 4, beginning on line 4, they get data from the BLM about the number of horses that are out on a particular horse management area. A simple calculation off of a map tells you what percentage of that area is state trust lands. And then it's just a matter of a little bit of arithmetic to determine what the amount is that would be billed on any given area at any given point in time. So I don't see it as a burden. But the value that I see in it is that this is, with private lands, this is an ongoing battle. It's gone on for years. We, Wyoming Stockgrowers, have been involved in litigation at least 3 times over this. The state, through the governor's office in the past, has stepped up to the table and supported the private lands in our litigation to get removal of horses from our private lands. But to my knowledge, the state has never, in making those arguments, referenced and built the case for the impact on state trust lands, which were given to them by the federal government to be managed for the benefit of the schools and other beneficiaries. So I think this adds that component to it, because trust lands they're not even referenced in the Wild Horse and Burro statute. They're just, we would assume they're treated like private lands, but there's no basis for that. It's not, so I would urge, this isn't the source of major revenues of the state. That's not the intent. It's not a source of a major burden to the state. It's a way to make a statement to the federal government to bring attention to the fact that these trust lands for which we have a heavy responsibility are being negatively impacted by these, particularly the excess wild horse populations. And finally, Mr. Chairman, if I may presumptively address the issue that Representative Heiner had asked to the previous speaker, so that don't have to come up here again and take up your time. We would strongly support House Bill 5 as the preference of these two for two reasons. One, the other bill talks directly about the state just taking over management of horses on state lands. If you envision the ownership pattern of lands in the state, as the Deputy Director pointed out, these are scattered parcels all over. You simply cannot manage horses on state lands. They're managed as part of a greater management area that includes state lands, private lands, and federally managed lands. So for that reason, I have a concern with that. The other one, just to be very honest about it, that bill provides for a $2 million appropriation. And based on what the state can actually do, the fact that we can't go out and just manage those lands, I would believe that it will be a hard sell to move that bill through the legislative process.
So I'll interrupt you. This bill that we're working on, 5, has a $2 million appropriation.
No, Mr. Chairman, the other bill, the bill that I'm suggesting you not proceed with
Okay.
is the one that has the $2 million appropriation. Is it not, or am I
No, it's
mistaken?
the
I'm
opposite.
sorry.
Yeah, it's the opposite.
Yes, it's,
So, yeah, and it
Okay.
may,
but that,
it tends to get a haircut before. it
I'm
goes
sorry
through
about that, my
appropriations,
confusion.
But it'll be this bill.
the $2 million appropriation doesn't apply to the first part of this bill, which is billing the federal government or the writ of mandamus. It's directed toward the part that talks about doing cooperative management with the tribes and with others to deal with the horses when they're removed from the land more than it does the other. But and that may be something that the committee wants to discuss, whether you really want to go forward with an appropriation, at least at that level. Perhaps some matching dollars to match federal funds that would be made available might be more palatable than that direct appropriation.
Okay, questions for Mr. Magagna? Okay, any other public testimony on House Bill 5? Come on up. Yes, you know, when I met you this morning, I thought, what does corrections have to do with the Ag Committee? But it has a lot to do in this case. Go ahead.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman, committee members. My name is Dan Shannon. I'm the Director for the Department of Corrections. I just wanted to make a few comments, but I'm here today more out of respect for the committee to answer any questions as far as corrections is involved. On House Bill 5 as well as 24, the definition indicates any training or adoption shall include all state facilities. And with the interim studies, as you're aware, interim topic discussions, at the Wyoming Honor Farm in Riverton, since 1988, we've had our horse program. We currently have around 196 horses there, with the capacity up to 300. The BLM is paying us $4.50 per horse up to 175, and then $5.75 after that for that number. So we're pretty much, with the infrastructure that we have, we're pretty much self-sufficient. Anything over 300, we would have to purchase out because we're not able to support, with our cow-calf operation, we're at around 265. And we lost the land north of Honor Farm Road, so we would have to purchase. Regarding our other facilities, we're not equipped at this time with staffing or infrastructure, even if we had, just the holding pens and things of that nature to house additional horses. So, Mr. Chairman, I stand for questions.
Okay, Representative Wharf.
Mr. Chairman, I would ask, has the Department of Corrections ever had as many as 300 horses, or what's the maximum that you've ever had in your program?
Mr. Chairman, Representative Wharf, we're right around 260, 262, somewhere.
Okay, thank you.
That's the most.
Okay. Any other questions? So that the public knows, we had testimony from the Department of Corrections that this was a huge program in trying to keep the rate of recidivism down with the inmates, and they believe it's a very helpful thing. We even talked about the possibility of expanding it to other corrections. That right now there isn't the money to do it, but it would be a place we could put some of these horses that are not presently wanted. Thank you. All right. Any other public testimony?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Okay, we're closed to public testimony committee. What's your pleasure? Been moved by Representative Heiner, seconded by Representative Wharf. Discussion on the bill.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Okay.
Would there be any way we could add language in here to, rather than a fine, to get extra mineral severance tax for keeping the ecosystem that the wild horses is running right now? Would that be possible, you think? You know, we get a certain percent of the severance tax on mineral extraction right now. Do you think that we could maybe ask for more? What's the process on that? I'm green on that, rather than a fine.
Yeah, go ahead, Representative Clausen.
So, Mr. Chairman, Representative Fortner, severance tax through BLM is currently through PILT, payment in lieu of taxes, and it's 50% of what this BLM gets. So it would be a long way around the barn to amend this bill to do that.
Yeah, the federal government really doesn't have to pay us that, I don't believe. They could tell us we're not going to get any of our mineral money back, even because it's basically owned by the federal government. So trying to get her done that route might be tough. It's just hard to try to tell the federal government what to do. If we can do things to encourage them to do their job, which is what we're trying to do here, that's better. Representative Winter.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Committee members, I just want to speak in favor of this bill. We have got to do something about the range resource out there. There's a lot of private land there, and as well as federal. But the primary concern is that range resource. It is bad, I'm telling you. And it was mentioned that the state needs some backing on what the situation is out there. And I believe the University of Wyoming is capable and willing to do this. I took my county agent with me, and we went down there and did a tour on the White Mountain horse area. And believe me, it is in bad shape. And the resource is still there, but it's not going to take very long till it's gone completely. And we have no alternative to bring it back unless you replant it. It's really a dire situation down there. They've had droughts for 5 to 7 years, so I understand. And it's pretty fragile anyway without a drought. So we need to move forward with this bill and encourage our governor to take a stand and really get serious about this situation. Thank you.
Okay, Representative Wharf.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I too would speak in favor of the bill, and I'll speak in favor of both bills, even though we haven't presented the other one yet. But I think it's a 1-2 punch. This bill's the tip of the mountain, or the tip of the iceberg, however you want to sell it. But I think this is the starting point, and I think it will lead to other impacts that we can identify as a state. It's not just the dollar amount. As has been mentioned, there's impacts to sage grouse, which if they are listed under federal protection, that has dire consequences to our mineral development, which also has funding mechanisms that really impact the state. So I do think both of these bills kind of go hand in hand. To me, it's a 1-2 punch, but I would urge the committee to support this. We've received nothing but positive testimony today, and I think that warrants us moving this bill forward to the body. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. The only thing I'd have to add is a frustration with the Horse and Burro Act and the problems that it's created. Before that period of time, the land users were managing these herds of wild horses as a beautiful resource for the state of Wyoming, and now they've just become a invasive species that we can't seem to touch, we can't seem to manage. And I'm especially familiar with the management of the horses as it was done on our reservation. Those land managers did a good job of keeping the herd at an appropriate size and keeping the quality of the animals and the health of the animals in mind as well. So I'm in favor of the bill as well. I think we're probably ready to vote. I don't see any amendments. Question's been called. Roll call.
Representative Blackburn,
Oh, excuse.
Vice Chair Clausen.
Aye.
Representative Fortner,
Aye.
Representative Heiner.
Aye.
Representative Larson,
Aye.
Representative Western, Representative Worf,
Aye.
Representative Winter.
Aye.
Chairman Eklund.
Aye.
8 ayes do pass.
Thank you. So the next bill is House Bill 24. It's Wild Horse and Burro Management, number 2, and there are some distinct differences, and I'm going to let Representative Worf walk us through this as quick as you can. Yeah, we've got some time. We already have a lot of background information.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Yet, I will say that there's a distinct difference between this bill and House Bill 5. House Bill 24 actually sets up an opportunity for the state to assume management. And to me, it goes hand in hand. It's not like the state just goes out and says, we're going to manage wild horses. The state goes out and starts to manage these horses that are exceeding the objectives that have been set and agreed upon by the state and the federal government. This sets up a opportunity for the state upon the failure or the refusal of the federal government to manage in accordance with that federal law that we've all agreed to. And it really sets it up to where the state would assume that authority and they could work with multiple entities. And the thing I liked was, I know during the interim, we did receive some testimony, and I don't want to speak for the tribes, but we did receive some testimony that there was some interest, that they were also experiencing problems with horses. And I do think there's an opportunity. We saw it as a good opportunity to pull in the tribes as a sovereign nation and to help us as another entity to put pressure on the federal government to manage these horses and to address those impacts because they are real. And it pulls in the Wild Horse Training and Adoption Program, which we heard from the Department of Corrections Director, Shannon, I believe. I hope I didn't get your name wrong. But, everything that we heard about their program was very positive. And I think that this could lead to more opportunities to expand that program to other correction facilities, not just in Wyoming, but maybe elsewhere. And the state of Wyoming could actually recoup probably never all the costs that are incurred by wild horses. But the whole point of this is to get a relief from the federal government not doing what they said they would do. And this is nothing more than the state saying, we're no longer going to sit back and let your failure to act obligate us to remain silent on the sideline. And I would say this is analogous to, we look at some of the states that have decided that they wanted to legalize marijuana. To me, this is the states standing up saying, the federal government has limited, enumerated powers. Anything outside those powers are powers reserved to the states. And I am going to say that's what this is. This is the state standing up and telling the federal government, look, we are a sovereign state And your failure to act is having dire impacts on our citizens, and the state's going to take care of that. So with that, I would leave that for any questions that the committee may have. But I do think it's a good bill. I do think it goes, it's complementary to House Bill 5. And it doesn't obligate the state. It just says that upon failure failure or refusal of the federal government to manage in accordance with federal law, that the state can take this on and start managing those horses. So I would be willing to answer any questions the committee may have.
Committee, questions for Representative Wharf? Thank you, Bob. We got some down here. Hi, Representative Winter. Go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I don't really have a question. I just want to make another statement, if I may. I'd speak in favor of this bill. You know, the federal government has had 50 years, over 50 years now, to get the management of these horses under control. And they have failed to do it. They have been sued and everything else, but nothing seems to work. And right now, the taxpayers of this country are paying over $55 million a year just to take care of these horses that are put out to pasture. And they stay there until they die. And it's gone beyond reason. So we need to support this bill and push it where we can. Thank you.
Okay. Okay, public comment. Mr. Crowder, come on up.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll be quick. Jason Crowder, Deputy Director for the Office of State Lands and Investments. When we read the bill, we understand that the management authority is, may not be, but it appears to be restricted to state lands. Obviously, those come under the jurisdiction of the Board of Land Commissioners, and we help operate those. I just wanted to let the committee know that we're not sure if we're the right entity or the entity the legislature intends to manage this program. As we heard through testimony in the interim, these horses are not wildlife. These horses are possibly not livestock, and so where do they sit? But management of the lands obviously falls within our office. And just to let the committee know, we don't have a program right now to manage lands. We don't have personnel right now. We'd have to stand all of that up to fully comply with the bill once it was either approved or the federal government failed or refused to comply.
Questions? Yeah, Representative Heiner.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So Deputy Director Crowder, this fiscal note says no significant fiscal or personnel impact. Did you not have input on this before it was brought to our attention?
Mr. Chairman, Representative Heiner, I'm not sure if we responded to that specific request or not, or how all that happened. Reading the bill now, this is our interpretation of it.
Follow up.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So how many people do you think you would have to bring on to be able to manage this if it became legislation or a statute?
Mr. Chairman, Representative Heiner, that's a great question. I think we'd have to determine the scope and breadth of the program. And again, as we were talking in the previous bill, we want to be participating in a broader landscape level conversation. And it may not just be state land staff that are part of this effort, but we would be doing it in conjunction with the tribes and with the BLM and some private landowners as well.
Do you envision that possibly some other agencies could be, we've got local conservation districts, we've got NRCS, that's a federal agency that would be involved, that I think they've got the resources to really look over the land and try to determine what appropriate levels of animals should be on, animal impact. Oh, follow up again. I'm sorry to interrupt you.
Mr. Chairman,
Go
thank
ahead.
you. Mr. Chairman, I see this as a serious breakdown of our LSO that they didn't consult with state lands with fiscal note on this.
Well, sometimes, honestly, I'm not sure what it would, I'm in defense of the LSO and the state lands. I'm not sure how you would respond without knowing for sure. clearly what your job would be on it. It's gonna have an impact on the personnel, but that,
We
That
rely heavily
shows-
on this fiscal note, and if they don't even consult with state lands, that's a breakdown in our communications.
okay.
Thank you, Chairman.
Representative Wharf.
Mr. Chairman, I guess I would point to in the bill, and maybe I didn't do this adequately enough, but it says on page 2, line 10, it says the state is authorized to enter into a cooperative agreements among state and local agencies and with the Eastern Shoshone Tribe and the Northern Arapaho Tribe, an official cooperative tribal governing body, adjacent states, non-governmental organizations, or other private entities. So it's a cooperative agreement, and that's one reason why I think there is no fiscal note, is because this is about trying to get everybody together to come up with a plan on how they would manage it. This bill does not say how it would be done. It just creates the opportunity for the state to enter into cooperative agreements with all these other agencies and identities that have been put forward. So I don't think that this is just dumped on state lands. I look at this as the state taking a cooperative, and I would assume that they would probably appoint, and I see Director Miyamoto there, but this would probably fall under the Department of Ag to coordinate, is my guess. I don't know. I would assume that's who the state would kind of put to point this, to head it up. But this just creates an opportunity for the state to manage. It doesn't say how. We left it open because I think there should be lots of things that are explored. The important thing is that the state takes over the management. That's what we're trying to get at, is we can continue with, as was already testified, it's been over 50 years. How much longer do we want to give the federal government to manage these things until the state just says, we've had enough, we're going to do it?
Okay.
So I just to make it clear, I don't think the intent of this bill is to put this on state lands' shoulders alone. State lands would probably, based on House Bill 5, like I said, you're the top of the mountain, you're going to start it. Once we start putting together those impacts, I think the state, obviously it says the federal government's failed, then the state would do that. So,
Okay, well, thank you. Committee, any other discussion? Any other public testimony? He's not coming forward, so I'm not gonna make him come. Yes, go ahead.
Mr. Chairman,
Representative.
I would like to ask
Okay.
our director from the Ag Department, please
Yeah.
come forward and
Director
and-
Miyamoto,
visit with us.
I was trying to. You've been volunteered to make some comments. I hope you're somewhat prepared. You usually are, so I'm not too worried about it. Go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good morning, committee. Doug Miyamoto with the Department of Agriculture. These are bills, obviously, that we've been tracking, and not knowing the scope of the intended management plan for these horses or the depth to which the state would enter into some kind of cooperative agreement for management makes it hard to plan for what type of resources you would need to avail yourself to in order to make that successful. What I mean by that is that could vary anything from the state envisioning an eco sanctuary type of situation where you have state resources that you're entering into an agreement with BLM to essentially keep those horses in a pasture land setting. That obviously takes a level of resources. Or if the state were serious enough to where they were looking to a system of warehousing horses, such as the BLM does when they remove horses, that's obviously a different level of management that you would have to apply in order to keep and maintain those horses so that they would be off the rangeland resource, but they would then be under the jurisdiction of the state to try to manage in some way. Obviously, I don't think any of our current state agencies are positioned to do that right now. So when I talk about cooperative agreements, typically with federal entities in order for some kind of management plan in different scenarios, we have to be careful about the level of commitment that we can apply to that situation and do a good job, an ethical job of upholding the deliverables that we put in that cooperative agreement. So there's a lot of unknowns, obviously wild horse, feral horse management is a tricky situation, and it's become to a point now that Representative Winter and I have been to several different meetings together and trying to analyze different options for successful management of these horses. And what we continually find ourselves faced with is that we would love nothing more than to see the BLM use all of the tools that are available to them in the Federal Wild Horse and Burro Act in order to manage numbers and populations of horses. But they get challenged continually through litigation that makes it to where it's impossible for them to use everything that is technically available to them in the law. They can't do. Permanent sterilization is an example. Every time they try to do that, or they become kind of gun shy and won't even bring that up as a potential management option for themselves anymore. My fear is the state of Wyoming could simply insert themselves as a substitute for BLM, propose these alternatives that are laid out well in the Wild Horse and Burro Act, but be unable to follow through on those because of challenges that would obviously come our way. I
And
think
it's
that
like
would-
the
that
tens
would
of
be
millions
imminent.
of dollars it'd cost to put them on the.
So I apologize, Mr.
Feedlots.
Chairman, about, maybe not being able to add the level of clarity that the committee is looking for in what kind of resource does it take, but without knowing the specific level of management that you as a body have in mind for the state to take on, it's difficult to assign a specific number.
Oh,
Mr. Chairman, thank you. So currently, or in the past, has the state talked with BLM? Have we all got together and discussed this topic? I guess, is this a way of bringing that about?
Mr. Chairman, Representative Larson, we've had continual communication with BLM over the numerous proposals for wild horse gathers for a number of years. Every time that there is a notice in the Federal Register that the Bureau of Land Management plans to do something with wild horses, you'll find the Department of Ag is on the list of commenters, and we have had that dialogue back and forth. In previous testimony, you heard Mr. Magagna mention some efforts to intervene in lawsuits that the state of Wyoming has also been involved in. I believe the latest one was maybe 2012. And in that instance, if I remember correctly, the state of Wyoming was trying to assert the level of damage of feral horses on the wildlife resources of the state of Wyoming, and we weren't successful in intervening in that. But we were able to enter into some discussions and intervening status when it came to Rock Springs Grazing Association litigation against BLM for impact. So yes, we have been involved. We have had numerous discussions and have tried to urge the Bureau of Land Management over the past number of years to avail themselves to all of the tools that are in the Wild Horse and Burro Act and leave nothing out. If there is a successful way to reduce the populations of wild horses and get those down to HMA, or our preference would be not HMA, high AML, appropriate management level. There's a couple different thresholds that they identify for the amount of horses that resource can support. And typically they'll gather to some range, but it's usually at the upper end of the appropriate management level when they do gathers. And we always urge them to go lower, because we know that those horses, as been mentioned by the committee, they breed quickly and population sizes double every 6 years. So it's a serious consideration.
how many years? 6 years? They double?
I believe
Oh,
that's
great.
correct.
Okay, I hope that doesn't. Committee, we need to. Are we good, public, with testimony? I don't want to cut anybody off, but we're about to gavel in like a couple minutes, so. Committee, what's your pleasure? Bill's been moved by Representative Heiner, seconded by Representative Wharf. Any Question being called for, no discussion. Go ahead and call the roll.
Representative Blackburn.
Excuse.
Vice Chair Clausen.
Aye.
Representative Fortner.
Aye.
Representative Heiner. Representative Larson.
Aye.
Representative Western. Representative Worf.
Aye.
Representative Winter. Chairman Eklund.
Aye.
8 ayes do pass.
Okay, committee, we are adjourned and hate to hurry anyone off, but they're probably gaveling in now.